Has Lucas made it? There's Lucas. Okay. There's Josh. Just fixing my attendance here. Sebastian made it. Eva's here. Paula, are you here? I'm going to take that silence as a no. Francisco made it. And Gabriel's here. Okay, so let me share my PowerPoint with you. Everybody loves PowerPoint. All right, so we're talking about the Vietnam conflict. Notice it is not the Vietnam War. Why is it not the Vietnam War? I mean, we do call it the Vietnam War, but it's technically the Vietnam conflict. Why?
Because the U.S. never declared war on Vietnam.
Okay, the U.S. never declared war on Vietnam, and Vietnam never actually declared war on the United States. So there was no war. It was technically a policing action. So it was a conflict. Although, you know, tell the people getting shot at that it's not a war. It was a war. So the communists, called the Viet Cong, are in South Vietnam, but they're receiving help from communist North Vietnam to take over South Vietnam. And so the United States decides to get involved. Why did the United States decide to get involved? You already know this.
The Truman Doctrine.
The Truman Doctrine and the
Eisenhower Doctrine.
And the Eisenhower Doctrine. Truman Doctrine says we will come to the aid of countries that are being forced by outside forces to change their government. The Eisenhower Doctrine says we will use force against other countries. So the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine initially send 1,000 military advisors to Vietnam in 1964. Now, a military advisor is supposed to do just that. They're supposed to advise the South Vietnamese army how best to fight against the North Vietnamese. But anytime the U.S. sends advisors, they send them with weapons and ammunition, because those advisors inevitably put rounds on target. So they're advisors, but essentially in 1964, the United States gets involved in the Vietnam conflict. By 1965, there's 185,000 troops in Vietnam. At first, many of them are Marines, because you know you pay Marines to establish beachheads, landing spots for the rest of the military. And the Marines did that. The Army did not have airfields, et cetera, to take down, so the Marines are the first ones into Vietnam. But by 1968, there's more than 500,000 Americans fighting in Vietnam. So that's a very large conflict. And the war is very unpopular in the United States and among the troops. And a big part of why it's unpopular is because Vietnam War is a draft war. And it was a draft war where you have a unit fighting in Vietnam, and as that unit loses soldiers, they would replace the soldiers lost with new soldiers that had been drafted. So the soldiers arrive in Vietnam not knowing the people in their unit, not knowing anyone that they're expected to fight with. You can imagine that this is a problem. Why would this be a problem? Anyone? So it's often said that a military fights for the man next to them, not for a cause.
Good.
Tomlet, chill out, man. It's often said a military fights for the man next to them, not for a cause. If the man next to you is somebody you don't know, are you willing to die for them? No, probably not. And so in Vietnam, we had this problem of replacements coming in to fight in the place of soldiers that had died or were wounded. And it created a huge problem in the military of troops that were not motivated to fight together. And that's why after Vietnam, the US doesn't deploy troops that way anymore. Replacements are not sent into a war zone, they replace entire units at a time. But in Vietnam, they draft an individual. So I could draft Asher and send Asher into war with people that he doesn't know in a unit in the military that he has zero experience with. As you can imagine, that creates a higher rate of casualties than if Asher is fighting, say, for his sophomore buddies that he's been with for years. So the war is very unpopular in America because they don't think troops should be dying in rice fields in South Vietnam. The war is very unpopular among the troops because the troops don't like the way that it's being handled, and they feel like their lives are being put on the line unnecessarily. So in 1969, President Nixon announces the gradual withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. And in less than 2 years, South Vietnam is overrun by communism. And all of Vietnam is communist, which leads many people to say that the United States lost the Vietnam War, Vietnam conflict. These are some of the pictures of protests of the Vietnam War. This is a later picture, this one here, from probably late 1960s, early 1970s. This is going to be sometime 1969. This is an earlier one. This is 1965, 1966. We know because of the weapons they're holding and the helmets they're wearing. And then this is a color photo from 1969, 1970. But so the opposition to the war in Vietnam, which was really a conflict, not a war. Why do you think there was so much opposition?
Because basically, like, they're sending American men to fight for a cause that ultimately, like, they don't really believe in and, like, really doesn't affect them. So they don't see the point in, like, killing their own men for something that doesn't really isn't really affecting them.
Okay. So today in 2020, when an older person says to you something that does not resonate with your generation, how does your generation respond to that? You have a particular phrase that you like to use.
Okay,
Boomer.
boomer.
Okay, yep, you got it
Which-
exactly.
Oh.
Right. And what's the point of that phrase?
To express your disagreement with a boomer's statement.
Okay. Okay, but you don't just apply it to actual baby boomers, right? Because
To say that someone's like point of view is old-fashioned and outdated.
okay, right, exactly. What you're saying is that their point of view is outdated. It doesn't match up with current thinking. So in the Vietnam War, by the way, those were the baby boomers, the people fighting the Vietnam War. Those are the actual boomers. In the Vietnam War, the baby boomers very much had the same idea about the World War II generation that you have about the baby boomers today. Funny how that works, huh? So they very much felt that the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, the entire policy of America that we will go fight anywhere in order to stop communism, they felt like that was very much a World War II generation concept, not a baby boomer concept. And the baby boomers were all about, we don't want war, we want peace, we don't want conflict, we want harmony, give peace a chance. It's all baby boomer ideas that you guys now make fun of. Isn't that interesting that you guys would actually talk about the boomers as being out of touch? And the main cultural shift of the 1960s was because the boomers thought the World War II generation was out of touch. Don't you feel closer to the boomers now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, you have a little bit of understanding of history and culture. So these are the pictures that are actually being shown on television. It's the first time pictures of war are being shown on television. There occasionally were some pictures from World War II that would show up in newsreels before movies. The same for the Korean War. There were occasionally pictures of the Korean War that would show up on newsreels before movies. But now Americans are getting these kinds of pictures on their televisions directly into their homes. And that's a new level of disturbing for Americans. So they're seeing over here, wounded American soldiers. They're seeing over here dead Vietnamese civilians. Here we've got soldiers that have just gone through a terrible fight. We've got a wounded guy. We got a guy that I don't know if he's thanking God or begging God. And they're seeing these pictures. This, if you see right here, this is actually a Buddhist monk who doused himself with gasoline and burned himself alive in protest to Americans being in Vietnam. These are disturbing images, no doubt, but these are the images that people are seeing actually in their home for the first time in human history. With all of the world having been protected from images like this, basically, or insulated, not protected. No one was doing it on purpose. Insulated from images like this. And now they're in the living room and their children are seeing them on the news. You can imagine that these images had a massive impact on the average American and their view towards the Vietnam War, right? Who's texting? Patricia is telling me she dropped the class. So these are the kind of disturbing images that lead Americans to be anti-Vietnam. So by 1973, all American troops are out of Vietnam except for those that are in the embassy. And in 1975, the U.S. embassy is evacuated, and all Americans are out of South Vietnam. And technically, we don't have formal relations with with Vietnam at all today. Although you'll find plenty of Americans that visit there. Vietnam is beautiful now, and it's peaceful, and they like American money. So the question is, who won the Vietnam conflict? I mean, if the United States packed up and left, and it was a very unpopular war, did the United States win or lose?
I think they lost and North Vietnam won.
Okay. Because
Because the U.S. sent men and like troops to fight in Vietnam, so that South Vietnam wouldn't become communist. And in the end, the only thing that happened is that the American troops died, and South Vietnam still became communist. So I feel like I mean, they didn't do it for nothing because they did it with the intent to stop North Vietnam from like taking South Vietnam over. But in the end, it didn't really work. So I feel like they lost.
Okay. All right. So anybody know how many Americans died in the Vietnam conflict? Basically 58,000 Americans died. How many Vietnamese died? Does anyone take a guess?
1 million.
You're close. 1.5 million. 1.5 million Vietnamese. That doesn't even count the people that died in Laos and Cambodia. Because we technically were fighting in Vietnam, we were secretively fighting in Laos and Cambodia. Although not that secret, it got out quickly. But so 58,000 Americans roughly, and roughly 1.5 million Vietnamese died in the conflict. And Naomi says the United States lost because the North Vietnamese conquered South Vietnam and made them communist. So anybody happen to have like a hat laying around on your table, or a pair of shoes handy? Look at the label in that hat. Does it by chance say made in Vietnam? Tomlet, does it say made in Vietnam? I mean, it may not. It probably says made in China if it doesn't say made in Vietnam. But Nike manufactures the majority of its tennis shoes in Vietnam. Vietnam has a lot of factories that make baseball hats for all kinds of companies. Vietnam also just inked a contract with Apple to produce the iPhone 12. Vietnam, while it is a fairly small country overall, is the 10th largest economy in the world. So larger than many countries of Europe. And Vietnam loves the US dollar. So in the short term, America withdrew, Vietnam becomes a communist government. In the long term, Vietnam is still a communist government. However, they are what we would call neo-communists, new wave communism, meaning that they are politically communist, but they are economically free market. And Vietnam has the greatest economy it's ever had, and its largest trading partner is the United States. So let me ask you again, who won the Vietnam conflict?
Vietnam.
You still think Vietnam won? Are
I
they
mean,
close?
Like
it got the most out of it.
Okay.
in
It
the
has
time,
the largest economy, and well, not the, but it like larger than it ever has, and like it it's still like in a way, like in the political sense, like it's still communist, but like I mean, like you said, it has a free market.
Okay. So where do they get their money?
From the US, but isn't that like they're using that relationship for their benefit?
No, definitely the reverse.
So the US is, but like, I
The
mean, the US
United,
manufactures there, but like they're the ones also getting money out of it. So
yeah,
isn't it
but
like
so
way?
Vietnam had to compete to get Apple's business. Vietnam had to compete to get the textile business from the United States. So the United States could have taken it to India, could have taken it to China, could have taken it any number of places. Vietnam competed for it, and the U.S. industries chose to go there. So it's economically in the best interest of the United States to use Vietnam. Emmy's got her hand up. You got a comment? Emmy, are you frozen? Emmy. Okay, we can't hear you, Emmy. Now make sure it's not me. You guys can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. I just want to make sure that like Emmy's talking away, I don't hear it, and like it's really my fault. But okay. So anyway, so Vietnam today is communist in its government. However, they are reliant upon the United States for their economic existence. So it's not that they won in an economic battle against the United States, it's that they were granted economic, well, they were granted money based on the US free market economy. Does that make sense, Luani? So Vietnam would exist as a backwards communist country if it weren't for their ability to manufacture. But who taught them all of that manufacturing?
So would it be more like a two-way, like like they both win out of it? Because like they're both getting stuff out of it.
Certainly. I mean, certainly it's not a one-way street. They both have advantage to the relationship. But when we're looking at global politics, we say, well, Vietnam is far more dependent on the United States than the United States is on Vietnam. The United States, U.S. industries have choices, right? They can say, well, we'll go manufacture in Vietnam, or maybe in Cambodia, or maybe in India, or whatever. They have choices. Vietnam has no choice. They're completely dependent on the United States and a little bit on China for their financial existence. So it's almost like the U.S. today has said, that's fine. You just keep voting for your communism, but you just keep making our cheap manufactured goods, and it's a win-win for everyone. So in a shooting war, if you will, Vietnam came out on top. They ran the Americans out of the country because the Americans didn't have the will to stay and do what it took to win. And I'm not suggesting they should have. 58,000 deaths is crazy. They should have left. But the US people didn't have the will to win at war. And yet, ultimately, across the next 40 years, the United States completely owns the Vietnamese economy. So I would say for communists, they're some of the greatest capitalists on earth. So it depends on how you ask the question as to who won the conflict. So we already talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis because that came before the Vietnam War. But what we need to talk about out of the Cuban Missile Crisis is at the same time Vietnam's going on, Russia actually constructs the Berlin Wall. I remember this is at the age of no night vision, so it's not like people could just watch what was going on. Literally in 1961, in one night, a bunch of Russian military shows up, and they construct a concrete and barbed wire wall separating Berlin east and west, making a definitive line between communism in the east and free market economy in the west. And that's going on at the same time as the Vietnam War. It lasts until 1989. These are actually pictures. I remember when this wall fell. It was actually at my grandparents' house when the first sections of the wall came down. I was at my grandparents' house watching it on TV with them. Very interesting because my grandfather had fought in World War II and had been in Berlin and remembered family in Germany. So it was very, very interesting to be with them when the wall fell. But that marked the beginning of the end of communism, except for here. Because at the same time that the Vietnam War is going on, a guy by the name of Mao Zedong in 1966 brought the Communist Cultural Revolution. When we say cultural revolution, we may think of the Renaissance, hopefully because you guys took World History 1. The Renaissance, incredible cultural revolution in the 1300s to 1500s. When communists say cultural revolution, they don't actually mean that there's going to be a lot of art, because that's supervised by the government. There's not a lot of writing. There's not a lot of poetry. What they mean is that Mao Zedong actually killed more people than any other dictator in the history of the world. And he cleansed China of anyone that did not agree with him. By cleansed, I mean he killed. And no one knows for sure how many people he killed, but estimates are at a minimum 60 million people and at a maximum 200 million people. Just for perspective, Stalin, remember we talked about Stalin cleaning up Russia, remember that, right before we went on our COVID break? Stalin in his cleansing of Russia killed 55 million people. Hitler, in his cleansing of Germany, killing Jews and other, quote, undesirables, killed 11 million people. So even at a minimum, Mao killed more people than any other dictator in world history. And so he required that everyone believe in communism. Even pastors of churches had to stop preaching Christianity or Catholicism and preach communism. So the US got involved in South Korea because of the communist revolution. They got involved in Cuba because of communist revolution. They got involved in Vietnam because of communist revolution. Why didn't the US get involved in China? Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower Doctrine, why didn't they get involved? Why did the US sit back and watch Mao kill millions, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of people? And they did nothing. Why?
To avoid a nuclear war?
Well, China didn't have nukes at the time.
Oh, I don't know.
It's a good guess, though.
Did they have like economic relations with them?
No, they didn't have financial relations of any kind. No economics shared until President Nixon signed that into law in 1968. Incidentally, at the time of the Cultural Revolution in China, anybody want to guess who was the top U.S. diplomat living in China representing the United States? Anybody want to guess? if you get this,
Obama.
I'll be really no. Obama was just a child then.
Was it Richard Nixon?
And no, Nixon was running for president in 1966. He
Kennedy.
actually been defeated in 1964. Well, actually, he was defeated trying to get the Republican nomination. A guy by the name
just a quick
of
sidetrack. Who was the president who was an actor?
well, you're thinking of Ronald Reagan, probably.
Oh, never mind.
Johnson.
Or of course the current president was also a reality TV actor. So we've had two actors, and why not? But better actors than career politicians.
What about Lyndon B. Johnson?
What about him? He was a rancher from Texas. I don't think he was. I don't think he was an actor, but I could be wrong about that.
Oh, okay.
So, in 1966, George Herbert Walker Bush was the U.S. diplomat to China. Who is he?
George Bush's father?
George Bush Sr., who recently just died, but he was president of the United States from 1989 to 1992. And he was the U.S. top diplomat in China when China went through its cleansing of culture. And many people said that they would never vote for George Bush Sr. when he was running for president because of what he had turned his eyes away from in China, not letting the world know about what was going on. So people were like, well, I'd rather have a Democrat than vote for a Republican that turns a blind eye to mass genocide in a country. So many people wouldn't vote for him. And in his second term, he lost to Bill Clinton. He didn't get a second term in office. And part of it was because of his inaction. I think a small part, but it did come to play. His inaction in China cost him votes and ultimately cost him re-election.
But wouldn't also like action in China be like wouldn't it also be bad for him? Because like it would have been like an unpopular war.
Okay, so that's a part of why the U.S. doesn't get involved. They're already involved in Vietnam. They're already actively fighting the Cold War against Russia, spy planes, so forth. Americans are at this point out of patience with war. We fought World War II, then we fought the Korean War. Now we're fighting the Vietnam War. Don't tell me we're going to go into China as well. And yes, I understand that millions of people are dying, but that's on the far side of the world. And right now we've got Americans dying in Vietnam. We're not going to send people to China as well. And so the United States simply pretended that this issue didn't exist, just simply denied that millions of people were dying. And some would argue that while it is very sad that millions of people died, it was not the United States problem in the first place. It maybe should have been a problem for the UN. It maybe should have been a joint problem for Russia and the United States, but they couldn't get along on anything at this point in history. And so China simply got a free pass, if you will, because there was no will to do anything about Mao's murderous activity. Today, when you visit China, and you go almost any place in China, you find Mao's picture hanging everywhere. In Beijing, in the capital city, there are his face is I don't know, maybe 5 stories tall, like 50 feet tall, hanging on the side of the Communist Parliament building and hanging on the side of the Chinese Forbidden Palace that has been palace for various emperors for 1,000 years. His picture still hangs larger than life all over the place. And it's pretty crazy. The people love him and they're devoted to him. They're almost brainwashed for Mao Zedong. So this is going on in China, and many Americans on the flip side pointed out, well, America has a double standard. They'll fight in the little bitty countries like Vietnam or Cuba that can't fight back so well, but they won't take on the big heavy hitters like Russia and China. And so this was disastrous for China, and it was damaging for the US reputation under the Truman and Eisenhower doctrines. So that's it for the 1960s. We didn't even get to the space race. Did the US actually land on the moon or not? Was this staged in a sound studio in New Mexico? The world may never know. Have you guys heard that a lot of people believed that the moon landing was faked in order to scare the Russians that the United States had more power than they had? Did they really land there? Did they not? So last year, the Chinese launched their first ever lunar rover. You guys know about this? In the year 2019. And the lunar rover landed in the exact same spot that the US landed their manned mission to the moon. And Emmy, you shook your head yes. Do you know what the Chinese rover found? Anybody want to guess what the Chinese say they found?
Nothing.
The Chinese say they found nothing. No footprints, which footprints on the moon should last forever. The Chinese say they found no footprints, no materials left behind by Americans, no flag planted in the dirt like you see up here. The Chinese say that the Americans never landed on the moon, and they have photographic proof. Now,
Oh boy.
that's also taking the word of the Chinese, which is not usually a real trustworthy word.
Source.
What's that?
It's not a trustworthy academic source.
That's right. It is not a trustworthy academic source. But they added to the controversy of a lot of people who say that the United States never actually went to the moon. They faked it to scare the Russians. When you consider that the entire computer power of the Apollo spaceships that went to the moon is less than 25% of my Xbox, you wonder, did they really go to the moon? I mean, I have a fairly new Xbox. It's like 2 years old. But it has more than 4 times the computing power, and processing speed than the Apollo astronauts had at their disposal. Could you get to the moon with that little bit of computing power? I don't know. Some say yes, some say no.
A lot of people say it was fake too, because in the picture it looks like the flag was being blown with wind, and obviously if you're in space there's no, like, it's a void, there's no wind, so people say that was one of the reasons why they believe it's fake.
Yes, but the flip side of that is that if you set something in motion in space, because there's no wind and no gravity, it won't stop moving either.
Yeah.
So if the flag waved because it was moving and placed into the ground, it would wave perpetually. So there's 2 sides to that coin. Some of the other things, you guys know the whole peace movement, Woodstock. You've heard of Woodstock, I hope. If you don't know Woodstock, look it up. The cultural phenomenon of Star Trek came into existence in 1969, the same year America landed on the moon. The Beatles. You guys know the Beatles, right? This is the big beehive hair of the 1960s. And birth control gave rise to the sexual revolution in the 1960s. There's no such thing as birth control before 1966. And with the invention of birth control comes what we know as the sexual revolution of the late 1960s. So that is the Vietnam War, the space race in the 1960s, all in one class. All right. Questions, comments?
I have one.
Yes, sir.
Mao Zedong killed everybody that was against him, and that's it, right?
He pretty much killed everyone that looked at him wrong.
Okay.
I mean,
Thanks.
yep. So on your final, I told you last week, it will have some information from third quarter and most information from fourth quarter. And there will be, the more recent the information, the more likely you are to see it on the final. Hint, hint. Okay. Yes, I needed to test some of what you've learned the entire semester, but because of the online learning environment, I feel like the more recent the information, the more fair game it is, because this is a terrible way to learn, and it's hard to retain stuff that you learned months ago like this. All right. If there are no other questions or comments, I'm still apologetic that we're doing entire decades of history in 30 to 40 minutes, but that's the way it works. I have no choice. Let me pray for you, and I will let you go, and we will see you on Monday, which is when your next homework is due.